Oh, I love that. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. So, hi everyone. I'm Staci, as Jessica said, and Amy and I are super happy to be here. So, can you hear us okay? Are we good? Okay. So, a couple of things. Obviously, the last session, you've had a very busy day. Hopefully, everyone has enjoyed their time. As Amy and I were thinking about just what to talk about, we really want this to be meaningful. And we're very laid back and just informal. So we just invite that into the space as we round out a wonderful day. So, as I said in my intro, I am a consultant. I wear many hats, but I do my work with the Cousins Foundation under my, thank you, Amy, with a group, Crystal Slab. And this is a firm that was founded right in 2020 around transformational change as opposed to transitional change. And so Leslie Grady and Kim Anderson are the founders, and I have the pleasure of being a part of their team. And so that's how I first met Amy, and I'll let you share a little bit more.
Well, actually, Staci and I met a long time ago. We've been colleagues and friends for a really long time, and I don't think we would have come to the work that we did in 2020 around equity if we had not known each other for a long time and already had some fairly high-level conversations on race and philanthropy. And I could call on her in 2020 and say, look, I think we're not doing such a great job when it comes to equity as a foundation and as a community. We had been working with a collaborative of funders around the pandemic, and I called Staci and said, we need help. So she's been helping us ever since. Yeah, so we have a great relationship. We definitely have open discussions about race and race and philanthropy. And it's going to be long-term work, but it's very meaningful. So we've enjoyed it.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
I think that was all we were going to give the context.
I will start. Okay, so we will start. Do you want to?
Yeah, we actually wanted to sort of get a pulse of who's in the room. So we have a Slido, which we want to. Oh, I got to do all these things at like 8 times. Okay, here we go. So,
it should be in presentation mode.
oh, do I do one more?
Do you know how to do it in presentation mode?
No, I don't know how to do that. Nope.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll just you can just tell us.
Yeah, so just tell us what is on your mind. We can't promise that we're going to get to all of it, but we did just want to figure out and hear from folks why you decide to show up today. Any topics or things you want discussed? Yeah.
Okay, so one question is just who at the foundation is generally, I know this is generalization, generally, the best person to try to build that relationship with. You're not always going to have access to the top gun, and so, who is that general person, and how are you making those connections?
Okay, got it.
We've been working on kind of building our grant writing capability and understand the value of connection, but we have a super small board, have sort of plumbed the LinkedIn network, right, who's connected to whom, but what are ways that we can actually be intentional about identifying organizations where we have good values and alignment, and then doing that proactive outreach to create a relationship where maybe there isn't one.
Okay, and I was going to say for our friends on Zoom, yes. So the first question was about like who specifically at a foundation might you develop a relationship with. I think I got that. And then next was sort of the strategies and ways to really to find that alignment and a good match for you as a nonprofit and a funder. Is that right? Okay. Anything else top of mind, folks? Yeah.
The things that you mentioned most in your introduction were about race. And I'm curious what work is being done in foundations. Every single foundation person that I interact with is white, and that funds me is white. So employment at foundations, how, I guess questioning that, as well as the existence of foundations. They're kind of built on the labor of a lot of people. So what work is being done in those two areas?
Okay, that's for the next section. because we cannot. I'm sorry to restate that. It was about sort of race and roles of philanthropy and folks that work for foundations. And I say that in jest, but we'll touch on it a little bit. But that's a really complex, I think, longer conversation too. But thank you for that question. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah.
So I think typically, I'm Yvonne, I'm Faith House Outreach, by the way.
Nice.
So I think typically, we try to, we know we're doing great work within the community. And I think oftentimes foundations are kind of out of, they're not connected with the real work. And so we find that we have to kind of adjust ourselves and it's difficult to find someone to speak to kind of come into our community, kind of get a better assessment of what we're doing, as opposed to having to run after someone. So because, you don't want, I just came out of one meeting talking about transactional relationship. You want to build real relationship and not like running after dollars. And how can we kind of forge those relationships that is authentic?
Awesome. Yeah. So the question was just for our folks online was around building those authentic relationships and what does that look like? It often feels sort of one-sided that nonprofits are often kind of chasing after the foundations and what role do foundations have in bridging that mutually? Okay. Well, those are all really good. I think we're going to cover a good deal of those. Yeah. So thank you for that. We just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. So I'm going to give it over to you to get us started.
Yeah, so I really wanted to, we haven't spoken, Staci and I have done a couple of events, but mostly to philanthropic leaders. So speaking to nonprofit leaders is a little different for us. So we wanted to make sure this would be valuable for you all. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the history of the foundation first, of like how we ended up where we are in terms of relationship building now, because I would say we definitely weren't in the place that we are now a couple years ago. So we've done some very intentional work these past few years. So starting out, like I did a very non-scientific audit of our grant making in 2020 and figured out that less than half of our grants were made to community-based organizations. So how did we define community-based? So often organizations where leaders are people of color, directly addressing the needs of their neighbors in community, and often their budgets are under $1 million or even less. So why weren't we connecting to these particular organizations? The problems that we identified. So we weren't transparent or making. Oh, sorry. It says it's on. Okay. 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 All right. I apologize. I will speak louder. So the problems that we identified is that we were not transparent. We had no website. And we were not making connections like we should in community. We were relying heavily on the networks that we had already built as a foundation. And touching on the race a little bit, our foundation, primarily white board, all white staff. So it was a problem. And then also another problem that we identified is the power, the power dynamics and trust issues did not allow us to build the types of trusting relationships that we wanted to with nonprofit leaders, and which then gives us the opportunity to have honest conversations with you all to understand what the real needs are and the gaps that we could potentially fill. So, we were not out in community getting to those real needs. And then our grant requirements and the grant criteria, how we awarded grants, often excluded these organizations, the small community-based organizations. And then we had no process to identify strong leaders where our board would feel confident investing in them, multi-year general operating support grants. So we definitely wanted to create a process by which our board would feel comfortable investing in strong leaders. And having that criteria of identifying those strong leaders in place. So that's kind of where we started. But we're going to focus on the relationship building piece because that has been a huge part of what Staci and I have been working on these past few years as a foundation. And I'll let Staci start.
Yeah, and so maybe I'll just pick up there too to fill the gaps. So when Amy, the work really started in 2020 with COVID and then all the racial reckoning happening. There are a group of funders in Atlanta, and Atlanta's funding market locally is pretty small as far as the family foundations, came together and they said, okay, we need to figure out how to do this work differently. And so there was a learning journey of a group of funders, about 20 or so, that came together and said, help us with racial equity. And so that's when myself and my colleague Leslie really came in and designed some sessions to help these funders. And there was trust that was built years before on what that could look like. And so then fast forward after that, Amy, and I will say it really was Amy's leadership that said, we need to do more. I can't stay in this role as a white funder and say we're doing community work and not really do it. And so she really, I would say it was you sort of saying to your trustees that I want to do something different. And they said, okay. And so that then began a deeper relationship with us around some coaching, and we implemented a whole process for what we called equitable grant making for the Cousins Foundation. And so we have a website that is now up, and just all the things, the way we do evaluation has shifted. So I just wanted to kind of that's where the work really began. And then a big part of that, though, that is really about building trusting relationships. And so we've listed several here. I think I just want to highlight maybe 3 or 4. I think the biggest one is around power. I mean, that's essentially what a lot of this is about, right? You've got an entity with resources, and you've got an entity that needs resources. And there's a power dynamic there that is there. And money just has a way of doing that. I mean, I think we all can acknowledge and we've experienced that. And so one of the things that Amy and I talk a lot about is just saying that acknowledging that up front. As a funder, it's so important just to recognize, I get the game here. You want something from me, right? And just being able to be authentic and honest about that dynamic. And it's amazing how just even acknowledging that seems to do something to the relationship. So that power dynamic is a big one. Of course, being present, continue to show up, and consistent. The next one I want to highlight is that third one down, identify and pour into leaders that you believe in. And so Amy referenced, how do we get our boards who are kind of used and programmed to seeing, leaders in a certain way, right? What are their credentials? How long have they been there? Those kind of traditional things we look for. How do we then begin to shift to look for different leadership styles and different characteristics or different ways to measure leadership? And so we've been doing a lot of work around that, and I think that's around how do we pour into people to support them. We have to acknowledge that a small nonprofit might not have all of the resources. You'll often find that small grassroots organizations are so used to being under-resourced, they work with a scarcity mindset, right? And so they are so good at robbing Peter to pay Paul and figure it all out. But I mean, that's not the most healthy way to operate. So how do we start to really shift and help them think about that relationship differently? So that's some of the work that I think is really important to acknowledge. Transparent, honest. A lot of this work is around taking risk. I mean, that's a conversation we talk a lot about. It's philanthropy takes risk in many ways. It's just sometimes they don't want to take risk when it comes to nonprofits. I mean, their funds are invested in ways that can be risky. Are you willing to take those risks when it comes to nonprofits? And then listening more, which I think Amy could talk a lot about. She's been doing a lot of listening and less talking these last couple of years. And with that is related to stories. So people respond to stories. And so we have really emphasized, to your point about how you really understand and get proximate with what is going on in community. It's letting community tell you what those needs are and listening for those stories. And so we have been working on a story project in the different neighborhoods that the foundation is supporting, and genuinely just listening and letting the people tell us what they need and what the areas for growth and improvement and what they want to see happening in their community. So storytelling, listening to community is another huge one we wanted to highlight. And then this other one around shifting to multi-year, and that speaks a little bit to that capacity and the level of trust you have in someone. So if I'm willing to say to you, we want to give you multi-year funding, that I think that indicates this is a long-term relationship, right? It's not just like, okay, I'm going to give you this for just a year, and then I'll give you this the next year. Once you show me you can do it. But it really is like, I believe in what you're doing, and we want to support you for the long haul. And so multi-year funding is, I think, a critical shift in how funders need to be thinking about supporting our nonprofits. And so it shifts you away then from that year-to-year robbing Peter to pay Paul. You have a runway, right? You have an ability to begin to plan and to even build capacity as a smaller nonprofit. And then the last two are also important. Last one's reporting and evaluation. That's, just really asking less. So instead of having a nonprofit fill out a long form and tell you all the mid-year grant report and all that stuff, just have a conversation. I mean, Amy sits down and goes to coffee with grantees and says, how's it going? And that's such a more wonderful human way of engaging with someone you're partnering with, right? Instead of like all the hurdles. And so taking those barriers down is also a really big thing that we've shifted to. And then this last one around opening the doors to other funders, that's really important too, as far as like the role that philanthropy can play. I mean, yes, they can write a check, but they're also conveners and they're also collaborators. There's a lot of human capital that they have to offer. So how can we develop and share those relationships? And the reality is, I've already said this, the funding community is small. And so Amy has trusted relationships with other program officers in other places. And if she says, hey, we've really been supporting Jerusalem House, we think this is a great organization you might want to be in partnership with, those type of relationships across foundations have proven to be really helpful. I think that's it. What else would you add?
I would just add that this list is, what we've learned so far. Obviously, we will probably, as we continue this work, add to this list. This list isn't something that works in every relationship. I think everyone comes with different life experiences, and I've learned that with different leaders, you have to implement kind of different, tactics in the relationship building. So, some of this may work, some of this may not, but this is how I am trying and aspiring to come to any new relationship with a nonprofit leader right now. So I think that, and Staci covered most everything on the relationship building. So what we wanted to do next, based on this list, I want to hear how you would describe your current relationships with foundation leaders in general, or if you think of one particular foundation. I would love to just have some input. You want to pass the mic? Okay, I will stand up.
Do I need to stand?
You could rate it 1 to 5, 5 being.
I would say trusting. So I think a lot of foundation leaders are trying to move in the direction of engaging with the leaders of the organization. So it's a trusting relationship. It's slow, because like I'm calling you, yes, we're building this relationship, I need money today. And you're like, call me back in 6 months. But I see that this is the direction that a lot are going into, of building the relationships, and really I want to get to know the people versus and what you're doing.
That sounds hopeful.
I would say that my relationship overall, I'll probably give it a 4, and that's only because I'm kind of rebuilding some things now. But I would say probably about 90% of like even the grants that we apply to through foundations, I go by establishing relationships first with the goal to build a partnership. So usually me or somebody on my team, we're sitting down having coffee or a Zoom meeting to have more of a soft yes and what can we do down the road before we apply. And then the reason why it's not a 5 is because there are a lot of, like, I just started the organization in February, but we have a lot of organizations where we didn't reach out and they didn't reach out either. So there wasn't really much communication in between a gift. So.
Anyone else?
I, in a previous role, went into it as a development director and had these built relationships. And so it was pretty easy and it was warm and it was like, oh, we love your organization. But now I'm in a role where there wasn't a lot of engagement done. And so it's definitely awkward, is how I would describe it at times. Some of the relationships I already had have been good, but it's been a lot of, no, y'all aren't ready. And so that's like, I would say
That means you're not ready.
we're not. I mean, it's just dependent. Like it's like, I mean, I kind of know, but then I don't because I have this like development experience where I focus on foundations, but it is like that, like it's a little awkward. I don't know if anybody can relate to that, but it feels awkward sometimes.
Yeah. You can be honest here, please. What? Anyone else? Okay, what's that?
Recently sat down with the ED of a very large nonprofit. He spent most of the meeting expressing frustration about how grant proposals ignore and otherwise totally disregard the detailed instructions. So it's like, I guess, with navigating with a very large foundation, how to take that feedback.
Yeah. Any other challenges that you all have experienced with foundations? Yeah.
The lack of feedback, right? The lack of feedback. That's, I would say that.
Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you. Thank you so much for your input. So, what can nonprofit leaders do to build those relationships and advocate for themselves?
I'll just enter this, and then Amy are going to tag team through these pretty quickly. I think what we wanted to do was share sort of like an insider view, right? And so there are some shifts that we have observed that are happening. And I think after 2020, we really have seen foundations wrestling with some of these questions like, oh, all of our staff are white. Should we do something different? Oh, we are having nonprofits jump through hurdles to do different things. So we thought maybe this would be helpful of like really giving you a little bit of some encouragement that there are conversations being had at foundations, and this feels like a good time to advocate and push and empower a little bit. So that was kind of the point of what we wanted to get across. So we'll go through these pretty quickly.
So find the right funders to work with and spend your time on. If they're not willing to shift the power dynamic or asking for too much for too little money, don't waste your time on it.
I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Like, is the juice worth the squeeze? I mean, if it's not, then don't. And I mean, I think there are conversations being had that like, it's like, gosh, well, they're asking for such a small amount. Why are we asking all these questions? Just make it a lot easier. And so foundations are, I think, having that conversation for sure. Define what exactly is that you need from the funder and then tell them. I think that level of specificity and clarity goes back to, oh wow, this funder, this nonprofit knows exactly what they need, right? And they are clear about what direction they need to go in. So it just kind of builds that comfort, if you will, in some ways. And so I think there's a hesitancy to kind of dance around what you need and what you ask, but like the more direct and more specific, the better.
I would just say, don't be afraid to ask for general operating support. Say, this is what we really need. I need to pay my staff. Let's do it, general operating. Your time is valuable. So if you're spending too much time on grant applications and reports, ask if they'll accept another application that you've already done. Or ask if they'll accept, if they would do an interview. instead of a written application if you don't have time to do the written application. We've shifted to, I've done almost 100% interview applications now because our nonprofit leaders have just really, I mean, it's like an hour and a 15-minute meeting versus whatever amount of time you spend on an application, 4 or 5 hours or more. So if you have to prioritize your time to programs or whatever you're working on, just ask them, just tell them and say, can we just do this differently? A lot of foundations are open to it, I think.
Yeah, and with that too, I would say, and then, sometimes then the burden falls on the program officer, because what Amy then does is she goes back and fills out the application so she can present and translate it to her board, right?
That's what it should be.
Yeah, and so there's that like level of shift of the burden from the nonprofit leaders on the foundation side, which I do think maybe this is a moment to talk about capacity. To like the conversation we have a lot of is, foundations will say, oh, we have a small staff. And one of the things we've really been emphasizing, well, if you want to do this work and be in community, it takes a lot of capacity from the foundation side, right? I mean, Amy spends a lot of time listening to stories, being in community. And so the conversation is, I think for years it's been, oh, we have a small staff. We want to use our resources efficiently. Like that's a lot of the language you hear. And yet the reality is sometimes you need more capacity to do this right. And so we're really trying to push hiring more staff in these at foundations, and staff that have been on the ground, staff that are maybe not from traditional pathways of foundations, but folks who have been in nonprofit spaces, folks who understand what it means to raise money or be on the other side. So there is a conversation, I will just say, around building capacity.
I would say it's that's a long-term hope.
That's fair.
I'm not sure how soon we'll get to that, but yeah.
No, that's honest.
But I think the more that staff bring it up, that they need more capacity in foundations, that hopefully the boards will start listening, the executive directors will start listening. We'll see.
Yeah. This one came out particularly around the pandemic and with everyone in spaces of burnout, right? So we are having conversations also around supporting nonprofit leaders through wellness. And when someone says, I need, a little more of, I need funds for some wellness and some time away or whatever that might look like. But if you're in relationship and the foundation wants to continue to support the nonprofit long term, have that conversation. I mean, I think there is an appetite or there's a space to have that, particularly coming off of the pandemic and what we're seeing across the sector, that none of us win when our leaders are burned out, right? Nobody wins. So have that conversation.
There's a conversation around, I think there's been a lot of transition at foundations recently, and just in terms of staffing and potentially losing that relationship with that foundation if that staff member leaves. If you're working really hard to build a relationship with one particular staff member, that person leaves where you left. So I would say, advocate to have more than one foundation representative at your meetings, as many meetings as possible. That could be staff or their board members, just depending on how engaged their board members are. But I think that would definitely help perpetuate that relationship beyond any one staff person. And maybe it would work the same way on your end, bring more than one staff member from your organization to any meetings as well, so that those relationships can go beyond any one of us. And then sharing your long-term vision as often as possible will keep us foundations thinking about funding you long-term versus we'll just give you this one-year program grant and that's going to be all we're going to do, and we'll just keep you on the hook every year and just do a new application every year. Keep talking about your long-term vision and say, I need a 3 to 5 year commitment from you to make this long-term vision happen. And, you may get a positive, you may get a negative answer on that, but I think just by talking about it starts to get it into our heads that we need to be investing in you long term.
I think the next one is around community voices. We talked about that, like just close proximity, continue to share those voices and bring home so that, you know, the folks making the decisions about the funding understand really what's going on in communities. So can't stress that enough. And then I just want, someone asked the question about specifically a relationship in a foundation. I don't have a great answer for that, but to Amy's point, like as many people as possible. And I mean, I think there are things you can look for when you think about, is this a good fit, or is this foundation, you know, open to these type of conversations and levels of relationship. I mean, you can kind of tell from websites. You can tell, they're just different things you can start to kind of look for to see where they are in how they're building relationships. So it's not an easy, direct answer, but just, you know, it's kind of feeling your way through is the best way. And if you can have multiple relationships, then if one does leave, then you have a deeper correspondence there.
And then when we talk about access, ask your funder partner to expose you to other funders. That's our responsibility. We should be doing that. So ask them to help you with that. I think especially the small grassroots, you know, led by a person of color, just don't have the access to foundations that they should. So ask for that access. Yeah, I think that's.
So, okay, I know we're looking at time, but does any?
We've got 5 minutes
Okay.
for questions. I know it's very interactive throughout, but we'll open it up for the next 5 minutes. So first question right here.
So our organization, thank you. Our organization is largely funded by state grants and foundation grants. And with one of our larger foundations, they're consistently asking us, why don't we charge our constituents, our clients, so to speak. And so I guess my question is that something that foundations are looking for, that you're being able to generate your own revenue? And how do you convey, if your message really is about being able to provide services and access for low to no cost, like how do you convey the importance of that while asking for funding?
It's a great question. I'm going to let you answer.
So yeah, I think it is typical for foundations to say, we want to see how diversified your funding sources are. I think though, you can push back on that and say, we want to provide these services for free for our constituents. And that's just our model. And that's what we're going to continue doing. And you know, if you don't agree with that, then we'll move on. But I think there's other ways that you can communicate, you know, partner support, anyone that gives you in-kind service, just any community support that you receive that isn't necessarily monetary, I would communicate to the foundations.
I'm just going to turn it over to see questions in the chat. If we have a question that we want to share from the chat and the virtual audience.
Yes, I'll try to be fancy and combine a couple here. So they're basically asking about where they start, you know, trying to find how do they find foundations that are open to funding smaller organizations? How do they connect and find that alignment? Did their board members reach out to other foundation board members? Like kind of how do they start these relationships?
I think all of the above. I think, you know, our industry is so network based. So yeah, any potential people in your network you can ask to help open those doors for you. I would. I mean, there's a lot of resources. What is that? The Center for Nonprofits. There's a lot of resources that you can get lists of foundations. And I would just encourage you to reach out to anyone that you see that you may meet their requirements, have similar visions, and just start to build those relationships. I mean, there's really, I wish I had a better answer for that because it's so hard to get in touch with foundations. But I think where you can start building that relationship, that's where you should start spending your time, because ultimately those will be the ones that once you've built that relationship, they will be your long-term support.
I would say maybe too with board members. I mean, I feel like boards sometimes operate in different spaces, so maybe it's even like asking your board members if they have connections. That might be a easy start. And then I know this might sound a little, I feel like sometimes this space is a little bit like, even amongst nonprofits, not sharing with each other, but there's some collaboration there. Like, who's funding you? How, kind of break down those silos. Like, we're all trying to not fight over the same dollars, but having that spirit, that generative spirit of like, I can share, a funder that really works and partners with us really well. I just happen to believe that the more you are that giving and open, then those relationships will come full force. So that's also just a thought.
We have about 2 to 3 minutes, so time for one more question. Saw this hand right here.
In 2020, we saw foundations give more than they ever have before. And now we're seeing them cut back. And oftentimes, most foundations are sitting on millions and millions and millions of dollars that are gaining interest every year. I guess my question is, how can we as nonprofit leaders express that the need hasn't gone away and that their giving needs to increase? You alluded to it about capacity earlier before, but I just feel like this money is sitting in an account gaining interest, but the people on the ground aren't seeing it. So what can we do as nonprofit leaders to express that concern and encourage that change to kind of give a little bit more in their budgets each year?
That is a great question. And honestly, I think a lot of the larger foundations are thinking on that. But I can honestly say, I don't know that too many family foundations are thinking that, because there's the added thing of, we want the next generation to be able to give away to their interests. So it's really hard for me to, I think I've come from a foundation that typically has given away more than the required 5% every year. And so I'm really lucky on that. But there are foundations that they just stick with the 5%. So I think, too, that comes with the relationship building. You can just say, there's a lot of need in the community. What can we do to kind of increase what that support looks like for the community? And I think there's a lot of our funders that I think are open to going beyond the 5% into their corpus. We just need to figure out the best way to communicate to them the need in the community.
I would just say, again, this is sort of an answer that it's probably not popular, but the question I often ask and we're thinking about is accountability. Who holds philanthropy accountable? Like, at the end of the day, who does? Like, really no one. And so for me, it's like, how can we do that? And I will say those conversations are being had too in this space of like, you're right. People came out really strong and lots of money, and now you see the regression. So what would it look like for us to hold philanthropy accountable and say the need has not left? And again, it's not a great answer, but I think there is enough awareness in the field that those questions are being asked. So that's all I got.
Well, we are at time. Thank you guys so much for your time and the questions. We have our final closing at the main stage. If we could give one last round of applause for our presenters and the time they dedicated. So, thank you.